My name is Farook Mohammed. I'm part of the technical marketing team for Cisco Crosswork, work with Dimitri. So what Dimitri showed you before was the provisioning of health monitoring as part of the onboarding of a device. Now, my session is about the complementary scenario where once you've onboarded that device and you've defined the NSO services, automatically health monitoring of your NSO services as part of the network lifecycle. So the question which we're going to answer here is, should health monitoring be part of a network service lifecycle? And I would say the answer to that is absolutely yes. And why is that? So when we deploy an NSO service or when we define an NSO service, I think we all agree before going into that, we all agree that health monitoring of NSO service is important and critical. It's as important as the correct provisioning of an NSO service. Now, if you look into an NSO services life cycle, say when we create a new instance of an NSO service, we want the service to be provisioned correctly. And ideally, we would want the health monitoring to start from the time it is provisioned. If we do not monitor the health of that service from that point onwards, we do not know whether the service is it operational and it's meeting the SLAs. For example, is there congestion? Is the bandwidth utilization up to the SLAs? So if we delay that, that means we are delaying the monitoring of that. Similarly, when we update the NSO service, we might be adding new endpoints or we might be changing the configuration. If the health monitoring is not in sync with the updates, then we are losing that the health monitoring of that service at that point. Now, similarly, when we delete, because health monitoring is essentially where we define the set of KPIs and we monitor those KPIs. When we delete a service, ideally we would want to make sure that if the KPIs are not relevant for that service, as part of the deletion, we need to clean or remove those KPIs because we do not want unnecessary traffic to come into the Crosswalk system. So looking at all this does make sense, but what is the realistic scenario in how the network monitoring or the health monitoring is done today? If we see where the NSO is provisioned, we use NSO to provision all our network services, but when it comes to the health monitoring, there are two disjoint processes. And usually what we see is once these services are provisioned, we monitor the network services at some point in time, but not immediately. It can be hours, days, weeks, and I've seen months too, right? So we are losing the critical information about the health of those network services at that point. So what that does is, and when we enable the health monitoring, it's usually a different system, and that system is where we go through the logistics of defining what the right set of KPIs are, and usually it's manual configuration or there are some hard-coded scripts. Hard-coded scripts, I think at this point in time, where this NSO is not actually automation. Maybe one notch above manual configuration, but that's about it. So what this needs is, it needs resources in terms of people maintaining the scripts for the health monitoring and updates. So that adds to the complexity. And not to mention the increased operational expense because we need all those people and the resources. So now conceptually, before we go into the details as to how we implement that, conceptually, if we can imagine health monitoring to be an integral part of your NSO service lifecycle, what we get is that when we configure the service, as soon as the configuration is done, we would ideally like to enable the right set of KPIs with the specific thresholds based on the SLAs. And from that point onwards, we should be monitoring, and we know that your service is operational from that point. It's meeting your SLAs, your bandwidth, your congestion, every information is there. And so one of the crucial things which Dimitri was showing is that when it comes to the KPIs, be it your model-driven telemetry, your SNMP, or your open config, there are thousands and thousands of KPIs. So the one question that we get asked is, can you let us know what KPIs we need to enable, right? And that's an iterative process in itself, and that takes a long time. If we can, because when we have NSO service, we know what the configuration looks like. We know what the network objects are, the ports, the interfaces, the ACLs, the IGPs. So we know we can identify that from the NSO service. If it is possible to extract those network objects and map it to the KPIs that are relevant, then we can tell the health insights to build a KPI profile with a specific set of KPIs and the thresholds that are specific to the customers. And from that point onwards, it'll monitor those KPIs. So that way, and if everything is done as part of NSO, we do not need a separate process in place to enable the health monitoring, because, hey, you pretty much get it for free as part of the network lifecycle. So ideally, this is the scenario that we would want. Now, the next question is it possible? So some of the slides here are pretty much similar to what Dimitri said, because still talking about the same Crosswalk health insights. Yes, this is possible using Crosswalk, health insights, and change automation. In Crosswalk it's a suite of applications which facilitates the end-to-end closed-loop remediation for any NSO service. And it is built on top of NSO, so the provisioning engine is NSO. This is a very high-level overview of the Crosswalk Network Controller. And we'll focus on the four main components: health insights, change automation, NSO, and Crosswalk Data Gateway. We all know NSO, what NSO is, so we're not going into that, into details of NSO. The Crosswalk Data Gateway. So this is the gateway for all the information coming from the network into the Crosswalk. It supports the traditional protocols, SNMP, syslog, model-driven telemetry, and GNMI. And it allows horizontal scaling for performance. Health insights and change automation, these go sort of hand in hand. Health insights is basically where you can define the KPIs, you can specify the thresholds for the KPIs, and then if the thresholds are breached, then you get the alerts, and those alerts can be sent to an external AI ops system. The change automation is where you can think of that as a workflow engine specifically designed for NSO services. It's not like a traditional workflow engine that we see. So now, I know Dimitri has gone over this. There's a recommendation engine for the devices because for each device and for each specific release, the KPIs may be different. So this will enable you to get the right set of KPIs. ZeroTouch Telemetry is where you basically enable a set of KPIs, and then you can push that configuration, the KPI configuration, to the given set of devices that you are interested in. So one thing, what Health Insights is not, it's not an alert management engine. It can generate the alerts based on the thresholds, but it ideally doesn't do anything more than that. It stores to I think 30 days or 72 days, but it's not meant to be an alert management system. So it has to be forwarded out to an external application, and it's got inbuilt feature to forward those alerts. It enables closed loop remediation by linking the KPIs to a playbook. I'll go into details of what a playbook is, the subsequent slides. You could configure or customize your KPIs. And in terms of the KPIs, there are different levels or different kinds of the KPIs. Say, for example, certain levels are where you need a 2-level threshold. Say, for example, the CPU utilization memory. You can specify, say, for example, 60% is a warning, 80% is a critical. So that depends on the user that needs to specify. But in certain scenarios, such as, say, bandwidth or congestion, right? You want different statistical methods, like standard mean or deviation. So you have the option of choosing which statistical method or two-level thresholds that you can use. So this is just a visualization of what Dimitri had shown. And here you see that this example here, I think, is for the CPU utilization. And you can see that, oops. There is a critical alert. That means when you configured the KPI, you specified the threshold, and it has exceeded that threshold. That's the reason why there's a critical alert has raised. And if it falls below the threshold, and within the time that you've specified, it will reset and it'll become an info. That means that the alert is cleared. So if it also gives that ability. So change automation basically uses the underlying NSO features. Now, the workflow engine is designed for your basic NOC operation. So when you are changing the configuration on a set of devices, you pretty much have different phases, such as pre-maintenance phase, you do a pre-checks, and then in the maintenance phase is where you actually change the configuration on the devices. And then you do a post-maintenance check for validation to see if the configuration is applied correctly. And the rollback feature is essentially the NSO rollback feature, which you can have on failure. But apart from that, there is another one called as continuous checks. What this does is the pre-check to the post-check, it takes time. And during that time, you want to make sure that certain services which should not be affected to begin with are still operational. Because we do see sometimes that all the NSO services have been provisioned correctly, but it had a side effect of something else, but some of the service went down. So this continuous checks basically runs for the entire duration between your pre-check and the post-check to make sure that your essential functions are still up and running. So how can we automatically enable health monitoring of your NSO services? So this is basically a 10,000-foot level overview of how it's done. Now, assume that, so in change automation, there is a one-to-one mapping of your NSO service. So NSO is where you define the service, and change automation has the concept of a play, and the play maps to an NSO service. And the play is basically the creation of a new instance of the NSO service. That's all it is. And we also have another NSO service for health monitoring. And each of these plays can be combined in a playbook, and you can define the sequence of plays within a playbook. Now, so for example, so assume that, now let's start, so ideally I would like to start with a concrete example. So for the NSO network service, if we have it's a layer 3 VPN, and there is and we define another NSO service for enable KPI service, for example. So when we and also we define two plays, one which maps to L3 VPN, and the other one is the enable KPI service. So when we initiate the configuration of the L3 VPN, it successfully gets configured onto the network, and that gets relayed back to change automation, and it says, once that is done, the enable KPI service kicks in. And what that does is it looks into your L3 VPN's configuration, derives the network objects from that, and it does a lookup into another table which says, okay, for this network object, I need to enable these set of KPIs. So it builds the set of KPIs list, and then it makes a call to the Crosswalk Health Insights and says, create a KPI profile with these set of KPIs and enable these KPIs on the same endpoints of the layer 3 VPN. So the change automation then calls NSO and says, enable the KPIs on the endpoints. And from that point onwards, your health monitoring of your NSO service is started. Now, if you look at this, this is tightly integrated with the provisioning. And if your NSO service changes, you run that enable KPI service again, and it will recalculate as to what these set of KPIs are, and it'll provision those. So by keeping your enable, by doing this, you are monitoring your the health of your NSO service right from day one, and it follows the life cycle of your NSO service, right? So this way, you do not lose any time or essential information to know if there are any outages or your network service has not been operational between the times of your provisioning to your network monitoring. So, so this is sort of one level deeper into from the previous slide. I think the focus is on the NSO portion, where how do we get the list of the network objects. You can do it in different ways. A simplistic way is where when you have an NSO service, you have an XML template where you define the configuration, right? So once the L3 VPN service is configured, then the inputs to the enable KPI service is the location of your of the NSO service and the endpoints. So with that information, it basically derives the network objects, looks into the table where it has got a mapping of the network objects to the KPIs, and then builds the KPI list, sends it to Health Insights. Health Insights then creates a KPI profile, and it also tells change automation to enable those KPIs. So this way, we have reduced the iterative process or manual process of figuring out which KPIs we need for the NSO service, and we also have reduced the scripts or the manual configuration that is required. And at the same time, we have enabled health monitoring right as this NSO service changes. So that's the demo that I had. And so there is a dcloud demo, and it's applicable for anybody. And you can run this exact same demo there, and you have those enable KPI service, NSO service. You can take that and modify that too. There's a blog post which describes the details of that. And for anything related to Crosswork or Crosswork Health Insights or change automation, if you refer to that, the product information, it'll give you all the details. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Farook.
Thanks.
Do we have any questions for Farook? I have one.
Yeah.
So are you planning to develop APIs and SDKs for Crosswork that developers can use?
There are APIs. So each of the functions that I showed you, we can enable all these using APIs. So simplistically put, any clicks that you do on the Crosswalk UI, there is an API to do that. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, René?
The gateway that will be between your data lake and the device, how you're deploying the containers, a virtual machine, is something, how you're deploying this gateway?
The gateway, yeah, it's so the Crosswalk infrastructure as such, so Crosswalk data gateway is part of the Crosswalk infrastructure, and that's deployed as containers.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, with that?
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.